Greetings and the warmest of welcomes to Australia-China Media Watch. This is a special episode looking specifically at an article published in VH from Victoria, a 167-year-old newspaper owned and published by Nine Entertainment. It has a readership of approximately 5.3 million people, and the headline of this article reads, Pathetically undergunned, the Navy's nuclear dilemma. The subheader reveals, the Navy has spent billions on new surface ships, but experts warn they're all but useless against China. Modern naval warfare will be won underwater, and time's running out for Australia to be ready. By Anthony Galloway, published on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2022. The opening paragraph reads, since Federation, there have been two competing schools of thought on how Australia should assemble its defense forces. The names may have changed, but the divide is always present. In the early 20th century, it was the quote-unquote Australianists against the quote-unquote Imperialists. Then it was Fortress Australia versus Forward Defense. And since the end of the Vietnam War, it's been self-reliance on one hand and the US alliance on the other. The author questions, are we building the Australian Defence Force to defend the continent and its approaches from an attack? Or is the aim to deploy the ADF further from home, alongside the United States and other allies, so that we keep the wider region stable and rely on a security guarantee from our big and powerful friend? The truth is, Australia is always trying to do both, but in a world of finite resources, the hard part is deciding where we sit on the spectrum so that we can structure our forces accordingly. With the rise of China challenging the position of the US in the Asia-Pacific, this fundamental split is at the center of the debate over how the Royal Australian Navy should be structured. While the likelihood of an actual war between the two major powers is remote, Beijing's actions, which include militarizing disputed features of the South China Sea, increasing military pressure on Taiwan, and butting up against Japan in the Diaoyu/Senkaku Islands, have made the prospect of a maritime conflict more likely. The author being rather careful to be politically correct over here by using both versions describing the same geographical location, the Diaoyu/Senkaku Islands. Moving along to the next paragraph, any real discussion about the Navy is always centered on submarines, given the vital role they would play in a major conflict today. Submarines, which can travel both underwater and on the surface, have long been a vital capability for the world's biggest navies. They can operate undetected for long periods of time, providing an indispensable tool for surveillance, as well as a credible threat to sink surface ships with torpedoes or anti-ship missiles. So the big question is, why nuclear submarines? Why did the Prime Minister Scott Morrison decide to fluff up its relationship with France, dumping a $90 billion agreement to build 12 conventional submarines, and instead developing a fleet of at least 8 nuclear-powered boats with the US and Britain under the AUKUS agreement? The nuclear submarines will arrive, wait for it, the nuclear submarines will arrive by 2036. It's 2022, by the way. 2036, the article states, at the earliest, but possibly much later, at an increased cost of $116 billion. Is it #worth it? Well, let's find out. The decision to acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines has very little to do with defending the mainland. So let's get it clear. The the decision to acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines has very little to do with defending the mainland and its maritime approaches, which Australia's current fleet of Collins-class subs could probably handle. In fact, some commentators argue conventional submarines are superior in defending the archipelago to our north because the engines can be turned off, which makes them stealthier. Nuclear submarines, on the other hand, are far superior in endurance, speed, and weapon storage. They can also stay underwater for longer because they don't have to rise to the surface to quote-unquote snorkel. Conventional submarines charge their batteries with diesel engines and must come to the surface to do so. Nuclear submarines use power generated by the nuclear reactor on board. Now, if a war broke out in the South China Sea, conventional submarines would not be very helpful against a Chinese navy, now the biggest in the world. They would only be able to spend about 11 days in the disputed waterway before running out of fuel and heading back to their station in Fremantle in Western Australia, according to a study by the Centre for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments in Washington. In contrast, a nuclear submarine will offer you 7x. A nuclear submarine could last 77 days. So nuclear sub, 77 days, conventional sub, 11 days before running out of fuel and heading back to their station in Fremantle. And this is why Australia decided to go nuclear, so that it can deploy its submarines alongside the Americans and other allies such as Japan, much further from home. I think this is worth repeating. These nuclear subs are not for protecting Australia's mainland and the waterways around it. These nuclear subs, this $116 billion investment, is so that Australia can deploy its submarines alongside the Americans much further away from home. So there is no room for error in the schedule. The first of Australia's Collins-class boats is due to undergo a full rebuild between 2026 and 2028 before going out of service in 2038. So yes, we have a serious capability gap if the nuclear submarines are delayed. And of course, whilst the Collins-class subs are being refurbished, what is Australia going to do? The Defense Minister Peter Dutton says in 2022 that he's confident that the first nuclear submarine will be in the water by 2038. Quote, "I have no doubt we have a nuclear-propelled submarine before that date," unquote. Mr. Dutton tells the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. "We didn't enter into these negotiations thinking that our partners, Britain and the US, were half-hearted. They're very committed to the task and we're in some fruitful discussions at the moment. But we'll have more to say on that in due course. But I think the nature of the conversation and negotiation at the moment is what gives me confidence. The government has given itself between 12 and 18 months from the AUKUS agreement announcement in September last year to decide which nuclear submarine to build. So it's going to give itself additional time between 12 and 18 months to make a decision which model to go for. The two options are to base it on the US's Virginia-class submarines or Britain's Astute class. Dutton says discussions are also underway on the prospect of more British and American nuclear submarines visiting Australia, as well as Australians going on their submarines as part of their joint crewing operations. The Defense Minister is also not ruling out an option put forward by former Prime Minister Tony Abbott for Australia to lease retiring American or British nuclear submarines for training purposes. This just complete and total engagement by the US and the UK. They're very willing partners, Dutton says, and in my mind, Peter Dutton's looking through a crystal ball, thinking this friendship is going to remain solid throughout this entire time. And quote, there's nothing that I'm ruling out in or out in those discussions. And I do think there will be joint crewing and there will be visits and all of that is part of the discussion, unquote. Dutton is also still insisting that the submarines will be built in Adelaide, saying the government has already demonstrated through a number of programs a desire to build our capability, and there are tens of thousands of jobs in the economy today as a result of that. Under AUKUS, the three countries are also exploring the development of underwater drones, which Dutton says will be absolutely part of Australia's future navy, but he doesn't believe they will be a replacement for submarines. Accompanying the article is an infographic highlighting the time on location for submarines at strategic flashpoints, with a caption reading, the number of days diesel, electric and nuclear powered submarines are able to stay at critical locations. From the infographic, what the illustration is trying to suggest is that for Australia's conventional submarines to be involved north of Taiwan, south of Japan at the Diaoyu-Dao Senkaku Islands, its current capabilities means that it's beyond range, but if it had access to nuclear subs, they would be able to operate in that zone for 73 days. Going further south, its conventional subs will be able to last 11 days in the South China Sea, and in contrast, a nuclear sub would give it 77 days of operation. The next part of the article reads, what would a modern war between nations look like? The last time comparable navies fought each other was in World War II, which presents problems in determining what Australia needs in 2022 and the years ahead. The naval battle during the Falklands War in 1982 was not a fair contest. Argentina had just 2 conventional submarines, while Britain had 4 nuclear-powered submarines. When one of the British nuclear submarines sunk the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano, the war was effectively over. Since then, the ability of submarines to find and sink ships has only increased. Despite this, Australia is spending $45.6 billion on a fleet of 9 new frigates and about $4 billion on 12 offshore patrol vessels. Its $3 billion class of 2 amphibious ships called Landing Helicopter Docks, also known as LHDs, has been in service for almost a decade. Marcus Hellyer, a senior analyst with the ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, says there needs to be less focus on big warships because they make a bigger target, and they will be easily sunk by submarines and aircraft in a modern war. At the very least, Hellyer says Australian warships need to have long-range missiles installed on them as a matter of priority. Defense is still in that paradigm where you have endless time to create beautiful warships that you'll send away on a US or UN operation, and their job is to sort of sit there and patrol, Hellyer says. They haven't got the message that this is now for real, and you're up against a near-peer adversary who is going to be just bombarding you with very sophisticated anti-ship missiles of various kinds. There's so many ways for the Chinese to sink our ships, and our ships are just pathetically undergunned. In response to that, the government has decided to equip the Navy's 3 Hobart-class destroyers with Tomahawk cruise missiles, allowing them to hit land targets from about 1,600 kilometers away. This would be a massive upgrade on the current missiles, which have a range of just over 150 kilometers, and give the destroyers this ability to strike Chinese targets from well outside its seas, so giving the Hobart-class ships a close to 10x capability to strike Chinese targets from well outside its seas. In the longer term, the Navy is also looking to equip its ships with hypersonic missiles, which can travel 5 or more times the speed of sound, that can be co-developed, so it's not exactly set in stone. It can be co-developed with the US. So what kind of war would Australia be fighting? While Australia is gearing up to help deter Chinese aggression in places like the South China Sea, we can't neglect our mainland and its approaches. The prospect of an attack on the continent by a country like China may seem remote, but we also want to deter the threat of force being used to make us do things we don't want to. Australian military strategist Hugh White, the principal author of Australia's 2000 Defense White Paper, says he doesn't understand why Australia is doubling down on big surface vessels because, quote, finding a ship is now a cinch and sinking it is now trivial, unquote. For Australia, this means it's very easy for us to stop other people projecting power toward us, he says. But the converse of that is that it's very easy for an adversary to stop us projecting power towards them. For this reason, according to White, the focus should be on maritime denial, stopping adversaries from controlling the maritime approaches to Australia by air and sea, rather than on attaining sea control closer to China. I think a battle for sea control with China is fundamentally stupid policy, because the US is going to find it extremely hard to project power by sea against China, and so are we, White says. If a great power is going to have problems doing that, in my mind I'm thinking, what more a middle power like Australia, with nothing more than 50,000 troops in its defense force. So we should stop spending money on forces designed to achieve sea control, so we can project against others, and start spending money on forces designed for sea denial to stop other people projecting power against us. White has long been pessimistic about the US's staying power in the region, and is instead in favor of Australia focusing on self-reliance. White believes the costs and risks to the US of seeking to preserve its position on Asia-Pacific are too great, and America will eventually withdraw from the region. Australia, according to White, needs to learn to live with a dominant China on its doorstep, and this means building a military that would impose an unacceptable risk to a great power, directly threatening the mainland. How do you stop a major power like China projecting armed force towards China? The good news is, it's actually not as hard as you might think. With two things going on our side: the fact that we are remote, and the fact we are an island, White says. You have to build a military strategy on what I call maritime denial. That is, denying the adversary passage across our maritime approaches. That's a very different kind of operational concept from the one Australia is pursuing at the moment. The article moves on to provide a snapshot of Australia's Navy. First up, Australian Navy comprises 6 Collins-class submarines armed with 21-inch torpedo tubes as well as anti-ship missiles. Australia has 8 Anzac-class frigates with 1 dual-purpose gun, 2 machine guns on mini Typhoon mounts, 6 crew-served machine guns, an Mk-41 vertical launch system with evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, and Harpoon anti-ship missiles. We move along to the Canberra-class landing helicopter dock ships. They come with 6 helicopter spots, 4 Typhoon weapon systems, 6 machine guns. The Hobart-class destroyers come armed with 48 cells, Mk-41 vertical launch systems for missiles, a single 5-inch gun, and 2 Mk-32 Mod 9 two-tube torpedo launchers. Beyond that, there is currently 1 launched Arafura-class patrol vessel, with 12 vessels planned in total, and they come armed with an autocannon and 2 machine guns. White is not a fan of the AUKUS agreement, saying it has been exaggerated for 2 reasons. The first is because the nuclear feat would arrive too late, and the second is it's not necessarily what is needed. Instead of getting nuclear submarines down the line, White says Australia should be looking at building a new version of the Collins-class submarine, while moving as fast as it can to buy off-the-shelf submarines such as Germany's Type 216 conventional submarine. One of the differences between me and everybody else is that I don't think we need a class of 6 or 8 or even 12 submarines. We need a force of 20 T4 or 36, White says. That's because I think we should be planning Australia's defense today on the expectation that we don't have a US ally to depend on in 20 or 30 or 40 years from now. For that reason, my whole approach is different from everybody else's. I just want to start buying just about any submarine I can find. John Blaxland, Professor of International Security and International Intelligence Studies, at the Australian National University, says he agrees more submarines are needed, but short-range diesel-electric submarines are not the answer. Just to get from Fremantle to Darwin, you need a long-range submarine. This is not the Baltics. You're talking about massive distances, he says. I agree that we need to double down on the number of submarines. We need to get cracking on getting them. But I really fundamentally disagree with the rationale for lots of small ones. They're ineffective, they're vulnerable, they don't have stealth, and they don't have range or endurance. Despite so many challenges over recent decades, it all comes back to whether the nation's military should be focused on defending the continent, or if its interests are better served by helping a powerful ally further from home. Opposition defense spokesman Brendan O'Connor says the ADF's primary responsibility is to defend the nation and its citizens. It has very important matters that are incidental to that objective, as we've seen recently with its involvement and responses to other challenges such as bushfires, pandemics, and alliances. So the role of the ADF first and foremost is to defend this country, says O'Connor, who adds that Labour supports acquiring nuclear submarines under AUKUS and promises to keep the arrangement in place. Dutton says the ADF has many objectives, but its main business is to keep prevailing peace in our region. They do that by working very closely with their partners, he says. The absence of the United States from the region would dramatically reshape Australia's position in the Indo-Pacific. For now, Australia is betting on the US's staying power, but the Americans need our help on the high seas more than ever. This article is part of a series, Is Australia Ready for War? The next article, which will be exploring cyber warfare, will be published next Thursday. Thank you so much for tuning in to this special episode of the Australia-China Media Watch podcast. I hope that you'll be joining us for episode 13, comparing the Global Times and Sky News Australia, to be published later on today. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is the ACMW signing off.